We have potentially breaking news out of the Middle East right now that the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, may have been killed in an Israeli strike. We have some reports that are saying that he has been killed. Others are saying it's not confirmed. That some are saying they've actually seen pictures of the body. We don't know yet, but that is on the list of things that may have happened here. And certainly many in Israel will say that's a big deal. But the real question is it really? Is that really something that's going to have any kind of an impact on the war? Will that help Israel win its conflict over Hamas? And to break this down, we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman back with us today, one of the best that there is on everything about the Middle East. Welcome back to the show, Mr. Ambassador.
Glad to be here with you, Danny.
Well, listen, I want to just jump right into that while they're sorting out what may or may not have happened on the ground here. What is the significance, if any, of Sinwar if he, in fact, has been killed?
Not much. Israel seems to be determined to kill every opponent, in a leadership position. He will be replaced. He represented Palestinian nationalism. That is not going to die. And if he is dead, apparently there has been a body removed from a tunnel in Gaza. And of course, Israel manages the Palestinians in a totalitarian manner. It has facial recognition technology. It has DNA samples from everyone in every Palestinian. And so they will be able to identify the corpse. And no doubt there will be another replacement put in. This is like Nasrallah and Hezbollah. You kill the leader, you don't kill the movement. In fact, you intensify the hatred and you enable the recruitment of additional members of the movement.
Yeah, and I certainly, it's hard not to think back to that big celebratory picture that we had in 2011 when the Obama administration took out Osama bin Laden, and there was all kinds of cheering going on about that. And then the next day it was business as usual. They replaced him with another. We ended up taking that guy out. They've replaced him again, and it just goes on, and no discernible impact on the organization itself.
Yeah, I think Sinwar's importance is mainly to the Israelis, who set out to kill him and have apparently now done so, or reportedly now are able to claim that they've done so. And that will gratify them, but it won't have any real serious impact.
If you could just briefly explain how it works, how these kinds of organizations are even structured, because to many Americans, they're thinking, man, if you take out the leader, all of a sudden you're going to have quote the head of the snake, then the snake is going to die. That's kind of the theory behind it. Why does that not apply here?
Well, in the case of Hamas, it's a democratic Islamist movement that took power in Palestine in elections in 2006. The United States and Israel then conspired to overthrow it, succeeded in doing so in the West Bank, but not in Gaza. So the procedures within Hamas are a democratic procedure, and it's a movement. It's not a one-man band. I think Hezbollah is a little different in the sense that the contemporary Hezbollah movement was really created by Nasrallah, who was still young and vigorous, and who was very restrained, cautious, risk-averse. I think Israel will regret having murdered people with whom, in the case of Sinwar, they could have struck a deal. In the case of Nasrallah, somebody who held back against hotheads in his own movement who demanded immediate retaliation for Israeli atrocities.
And what does this do, in fact, to the possibility of ever reaching a political settlement and a negotiated end to the war in Hamas? Because Israel obviously already assassinated one senior Hamas leader in Tehran during the presidential inauguration, which is what spawned the last round of missiles from Iran against Israel. But what does this do? Is there anyone left with whom they can negotiate, that can even negotiate, that has the power to negotiate for the Hamas side? And what does this say about the progress of this war?
Two things. First, it's not a war against Hamas. It's a war against the Palestinian people, the objective of which is to exterminate the Palestinians in Gaza. That is, if they can't be killed, they will be starved to death in northern Gaza, which Israel intends to annex. The second point is that the death of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, under the most provocative circumstances possible, was the death of someone who was a relative moderate and reasonable person who had accepted the two-state solution in Palestine. And Sinwar was a much harder line person. And this is the kind of progression you get when you do assassinations. You don't get somebody who's more congenial and accommodating. You get somebody who's harder line. A final point, Gaza has been destroyed. So at the moment, Israel is trying to concentrate the remaining population in an area that it is declared to be a safe area. And we know from past experience that when it puts people in a safe area, it makes the area very unsafe. So the plan is clear, both in Gaza and now in southern Lebanon, and that is extermination, ethnic cleansing, and settlement.
And gosh, I mean, where can this go? Because there's, well, and I'll show this here in a second. But you mentioned the starvation campaign. It's been in a lot of the news here, and there was actually a interview on Fox News this morning with Ambassador Danon from Israel, and they say, well, what about this that you're blocking aid? And of course, he says, no, we're definitely not blocking. We get tens of thousands of stuff in there, and then, like they often do, he'll turn it and he says, and what about the hostages? Nobody ever talks about feeding the hostages, et cetera. Change directions entirely. But you say that that's not accurate, that they are blocking.
No, they're totally blocking all. The UN says no food or medicine or anything else has gone in there since October 1st. And we're now, so in this context, I have to say, the Biden administration's leaked letter to the Israelis, signed by Blinken and Austin, is one of the most cynical political maneuvers that I can recall. First of all, it sets a 30-day deadline for Israel to comply with requirements that have been set a year ago, which it has not complied with. In that 30 days, we will have an election. We will be in a post-election period. Who knows whether the statement that we will cut off arms sales to Israel will be implemented. We'll have a lame duck administration, regardless of the outcome of the election. Second, in that 30-day period, a huge number of people are going to die from starvation or from snipers or from bombs. So this is all calculated to address a mounting political problem in the United States, namely that young people, including Jewish young people, whom I applaud for their moral stance, are revolted by the administration's continued support for genocide and mass murder in West Asia. And nobody is enthusiastic except Mr. Netanyahu about attacking Iran, which he clearly intends to do before the election, if possible. And I got to say, you talk about cynical. Matt Miller was asked about this whole starvation issue here. Had this to say.
What we have seen over the past few months is that the level of humanitarian assistance has not been sustained. In fact, it has fallen by over 50% from where it was at its peak. So the Secretary, along with Secretary Austin, thought it was appropriate to make clear to the government of Israel that there are changes that they need to make again to see that the level of assistance making it into Gaza comes back up from the very, very low levels that it is at today.
This just puzzles me how you can acknowledge that it is true that it's been cut by 50%, probably more than that, according to what you're saying there about the cutoff since October 1st. And then just they make clear to Netanyahu, which means that we begged and asked and then had our hands slapped away, and nothing's going to happen, as you say.
We have made our view clear on multiple occasions to Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, and the members of his cabinet, who have basically brushed these requests off with contempt. And I think that we deserve contempt. We've had a year to deal with this issue. And the issue that the idea that the hostages are somehow more important than what is probably 200,000 dead people is just chilling. I don't think it's for nothing that Mr. Miller has earned the nickname Smirkula. That's what he's called by a lot of people these days.
Yeah, but you know, I wonder if you can maybe help me understand a little bit. Even if you're pro-Israel, presumably in the United States, you'd also be pro-American, at least equal. But we have to acknowledge that the administration is just powerless in front of whatever Netanyahu wants, and on any capacity, anything you want to look at, ceasefires, don't go into Rafah, let the aid stuff in, two-state solution. I mean, you name it. Everything we have asked, they have done none of it. And we just look pathetic, even on an American stage, much less a global stage. How is it that we just are utterly powerless?
Well, Mr. Miller, on another occasion, when asked about that, said, well, Israel's a sovereign country, so it has to make its own decisions, blithely pushing aside the fact that it could not make any of those decisions without our unstinting support. We have the leverage to stop this slaughter. We have not used it. I really doubt that the threat in the letter from Blinken and Austin will in fact be carried through after the election. We've said expended a lot of empty words. We've done nothing. Our credibility internationally is very close to zero. Our credibility with the Israeli government clearly is zero. And so, you know, if Mr. Netanyahu can get the wider regional war that he wants by attacking Iran in a way that he's said will be clever and extremely painful, which I presume means another sort of assassination of Nasrallah kind of exercise against the leadership in Iran, then I think he has, in a sense, won tactically. Tactically, Israel has gotten everything it wants. Strategically, I think it has written its own death sentence.
Yeah. And it looks like that they're trying to take us down with them. And so far, we seem to be contributing to that. As speaking of American interests, overnight, B-2 bombers were used against targets in Yemen. And this, again, just looks like an extension of the Israeli Air Force, because they themselves have been striking Yemen targets for quite a while now. It looks like we're joining in the fray as an extension of Netanyahu's armed forces. But then, you know what? You have to start looking at the ordnance being used here. This is a headline I found actually from back in July. It's important to note here. This is from July when it was looking at how much weapons we have used in the Red Sea deal against the Houthis to try to keep the Red Sea open. We had at that time spent 770 precision-guided munitions. These are everything from cruise missiles to interceptors, etc. in there. And this thing has only gone up. So apparently, it's well over 800 by now. And some of our annual production rates are about 155 per year, 125 in some other categories. And we've burned through that in just a matter of months. And now we've switched off with somebody else. And there is absolutely no end in sight to that. We already know that, Jake Sullivan admitted last month that there were 17 different countries that we provided long-range interceptor missiles for. I'm sorry, not long-range, interceptor missiles for, that now we're not giving any of them to anybody because we've given them so many to Ukraine. Now then, we're also starting to expend those here. We are spending ourselves into oblivion in capacity, not just money.
You have to consider that the use of the B-2, which flies from the United States with multiple refueling en route to drop bombs in Yemen, is a clear indication that of our inability to sustain the presence in the Red Sea and in the region that we previously had. Not only have we expended weapons, we have exhausted our sailors, and we have put our ships in a position where they have to have maintenance and be brought back to American ports for that. So it's not just that we've expended munitions and weakened ourselves globally, but we've shown the limits of our ability to project power, except now directly from the United States. God help us if we get into a major war with Russia or China or even Iran. We are approaching our limits of capacity.
And in fact, speaking of Iran, you mentioned that a second ago. Additionally, we have deployed now 100 U.S. troops on the ground with the THAAD missile system, and so that we are. It's not just the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group that's currently in the region. Now we also have boots on the ground, so that the potential vulnerability and risk to the U.S. of getting drawn into a war is going to go up. But it's also using more of our capacity, because there's only, I think it was 7 of these batteries in existence anywhere, and now we've given one of them to Israel. What does this do to our to continue to degrade our ability to defend the United States?
Well, it's an example, I think, of putting Israeli interests as they define them ahead of our own. The purpose of this deployment has not really been explained. Hezbollah claimed that it knocked out the radar that supported the Israeli version, Arrow 3, of high-altitude interceptors, which is what that is. If that's the case, then we are filling in for Israel, because the Israeli self-defense capability has been degraded. And having said that, there is no indication that all of the combination that Israel has, which Israel has also expended enormous quantities of munitions, interceptors, and the like, and it apparently, the last Iranian strike on it took out some important facilities, not reported because the Israeli press has been muzzled, and they won't allow any reporting, even if we had reporters who were willing to report negative news about Israel. They're few and far between. So this is a tripwire. We now have American troops on the ground who are in a position of jeopardy. And I think we better hope that Iran doesn't target them.
Well, and speaking of targeting Iran, there has been a lot of speculation that the reason why Israel has thus far not responded to the October 1st Iranian missile strike is because of lots of behind the scenes negotiations, whether it's from the United States basically begging them not to do anything before the election, or even Russia and China trying to weigh in because they have a lot of interest for Iran not to get hit and to certainly not have a decapitation strike against them. But the ambassador to Israel, the UN ambassador, Danny Danon, this morning said, hey, listen, y'all, don't be thinking that this is not going to happen. It is. Watch this.
We will retaliate against Iran. We haven't forgotten what happened. We will decide about the timing, the location. I cannot disclose the details, but I can tell you one thing. It will be very painful for the Iranian regime, and they will think twice in the future whether to attack Israel or not.
And of course, they don't think twice. Iran doesn't think twice. They're always responding to what Israel did first. That always gets left out there. But if he makes good on that, if Netanyahu makes good on that threat right there, what do you think is going to be the response from Iran this time?
I think Iran has escalated steadily from April to October 1st. It has further escalation possibilities. If Israel does what it threatens to do, it will have a very forceful response from Iran, regardless of what damage it does to Iran.
Well, and actually, I wanted to ask you that specific question because there has been a lot in the media here lately that apparently the Biden administration has successfully gotten the nuclear sites and the energy sites off the target list, implying that what other things may be hit would somehow not trigger a response from Iran. What do you say to that?
Very ridiculous assertion. No country can accept the right of another country to kill its people and attack its military installations and not respond. Israel itself exemplifies that principle. And as for Israeli assurances to the United States about how they will behave militarily, I would say these have less credibility than Confederate currency these days.
Oh man. Yeah, that's not a good situation. And what is your best guess as to what Iran would do? How if it strikes? Well, let's just say that Israel actually does what is reported, and that they don't hit the energy or the nuclear, but they hit the IRGC or they hit some of the missile sites, etc. What range of possibilities do you see coming back from Iran?
So far, Iran has only aimed at and struck military targets in Israel. It is not aimed at civilians. I think you could see a retaliatory escalation to strikes on civilians. Iran has not used its top-grade weaponry. It has been very abstemious, holding back. I think it will use its more effective weapons, and it may even be able still to coordinate with Hezbollah and Iraqi militias to further complicate the effort of the United States and Israel to defend Israel against reprisal. So I suspect Israel says it has a very painful, surprising response in mind. I don't think one can dismiss that. But I suspect Iran also has its options well studied and laid out and ready to go.
So this thing is far from over and can escalate and continue up those rungs of the escalation ladder.
Tit for tat. And you know the saying that Gandhi said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and pretty soon everybody's blind and doesn't have any teeth. Yeah, we are definitely heading in that direction here. One last thing I wanted to talk about on this topic before we move on to another one here is one other thing that the ambassador said in that interview with Fox News. He was asked about those darn United Nations people that are so mean and how that they need to be reformed. And I found his logic very interesting, and one might often called also called sort of 1984-ish. Watch this.
I think the UN must go back and look at the cause of establishing the UN. And what we have seen the last year, we have seen that the UN forgot about the moral issues that they have to advocate. They were not able until today to condemn October 7th, the atrocities. They were not able to condemn Hamas. They are not condemning Hezbollah. And even yesterday, the Security Council issued a statement calling all parties to hold their fire. They have to make the distinction between the terrorists who attack a sovereign nation, but they are not doing it.
That is absolutely macabre.
Yeah.
Of course, the UN did condemn Hamas. It has condemned Hezbollah on numerous occasions. It has a peacekeeping force in Lebanon that Israel is deliberately attacking, knocking down walls on forts, knocking down observation towers, wounding UN personnel. There is a move now and a demand by some members of the force in Lebanon, the Spanish, the Irish, others, the Italians, to kick Israel out of the UN. And finally, I would just say, which in fact would be entirely justified given Israeli stiff arming of the United Nations. Finally, I just note that the UN was established along with Geneva Conventions and other things to prevent exactly what Israel has been doing. That is, conducting wars of aggression, genocide, mass murder, assassinations, and to substitute the rule of law for the rule of force, which is the only rule that Israel follows. So this is truly a bizarre, as you said, Orwellian statement. by Ambassador Dannon.
Yeah, and there's nothing to add to that, and no answers that I can think of to solve this problem, short of one side just spinning itself into oblivion and a collapse of the capacity to continue to wage war, whether that's political cover that the United States provides or the physical means, which could one day literally run out. But anyway, we'll cover that part separately. There's one other thing before we let you go today I want to look at here, because it's also got a lot of ramifications for potential regional security, this time in Europe, and therefore potentially American national security. President Zelensky of Ukraine went to his parliament, the Rada, yesterday, and finally publicly unveiled his plan for victory and what he planned to do. And he had some interesting things that he finally admitted out loud in public, the most important of which had to do with NATO.
Перший пункт – це запрошення в НАТО зараз. Другий пункт – оборона. Це незворотнє зміцнення української оборони проти агресора. Це реалістично захищати наші позиції на полі бою в Україні і водночас обов'язково повертати війну на територію Росії.
So, step one, join NATO now. Step two, invade Russia right after that. What could possibly go wrong with that? But then shortly after that, the new NATO Secretary General Rutte was asked about, are they coming in right now? And he says, yeah, well, I'll let him say it.
I visited Kiev 2 weeks ago, and I spoke with Zelensky also in London last week, and we are in regular contact, and I'm very much aware of all the elements of the victory plan. As you also know, NATO in Washington decided to make the path towards NATO membership for Ukraine an irreversible path. That's clearly stated. And we are in close contact with allies, with Ukraine, to see how we can take next steps, how to do that in a way which is also successful, which is fruitful, etc. Obviously, these are talks I cannot give you all the insights about. That's impossible in a press conference like this. But the victory plan, of course, we very much are debating with them and using every opportunity to take that one step by step further.
So in a full minute, he says, we're in contact with them. We talked about it. We talked about them. We're debating everything except that guy's crazy. There's no way he's ever coming into NATO. What do you say to that?
The third point on Zelensky's 5-point plan was, in addition to attacking Russia, in addition to magically getting into NATO right away, despite the fact that an increasing number of NATO members do not want Ukraine, and despite the fact that we've already shown we are not prepared to defend Ukraine directly against Russia, the third point was to station weapons on Ukrainian territory, NATO, US weapons. So all he's doing is validating the points that the Russians made at the outset of the war, that if Ukraine is in NATO, it will attack Russia, and it will be the site of weapons from the West on Russia's borders aimed at Russia. Now, there were other points, but basically, this is an act of political desperation. You could see the initial reaction from the Ukrainian audience, which was, very skeptical and hesitant until they were roused to stand by somebody up in the dais. I think my interpretation of this is that the only explanation for it, since it's obvious fantasy, is that Zelensky can now turn around and say, well, NATO didn't come through, therefore we have to make concessions to the Russians. So he's using NATO's obvious unwillingness to do any of this, and maybe our incapacity to do it, to find a way to call off the war before it's too late.
So I think we've already passed that point.
He's lost 20% or more of Ukraine's territory. and diminished the population of Ukraine by a really awesome percentage. The number of wounded and killed is huge, although it remains a state secret. We're beginning to get some glimpse of it, and the figures are horrifying. So nothing has been accomplished except to rearm Russia, and and to reinvigorate Russian industry and reorient it, push it toward China. And here, I would say one thing we need to bear in mind is that this administration, Biden administration, is going out having created the possibility of World War III, starting in Ukraine, starting in the Taiwan Strait, a widening of the war, support for genocide, loss of credibility, and a widening war in the Middle East. And suppose there is a widened war in Europe or the Middle East. If you were North Korea or China, wouldn't you take advantage of that? We know that the Chinese-Russian relationship is intensifying. The Entente has become very, very rich with contingency planning. So you can't compartmentalize things the way we do. We are at a very dangerous moment, not just in the Middle East, but in Ukraine, as Zelensky, I think, is reflecting, and also in the Taiwan area, where the Chinese just ran a very impressive precursor exercise for an invasion and a blockade. The Chinese Coast Guard is now sailing around Taiwan, exercising legal jurisdiction over the island from somewhat of a distance at present, but closer and closer. These are not good trends, and they reflect the absence of any national strategy from the United States other than deploying the military and using them supposedly to deter, when in fact they more often provoke than deter.
Right. And actually along this line, you mentioned 120, that exercise had 125 aircraft involved and a bunch on the sea. Then this one here from last month, where there was the largest Russian naval drills since the post-Soviet time, along with China, in the Sea of Japan. It involved over 400 warships, submarines, and other vessels, etc. And one of the senior American naval officers at that time warned against the thought of saying, "Oh, well, look what the Russian Navy. Oh, yeah, how great did they do with the Black Sea Fleet?" And they got crippled by a country that didn't even have a navy. And they said, "Yeah, don't be talking about that transferring that to this fleet here, because they are still very, very capable missile carriers and submarines, etc." So that's kind of a bigger issue. And the problem, the many problems, I guess, is you kind of alluded to it, is the lack or possibly even the death of diplomacy. And here is one of the things that our senior diplomat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, said about negotiations and even talking with the Russians.
With regard to Minister Lavrov, no, we didn't speak directly, but I was in the room when he made his intervention on behalf of Russia. He was in the room when I made my intervention on behalf of the United States. So I think it's safe to say that we heard each other. I didn't hear anything new, unfortunately, about the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. It's striking that so many countries that are half a world away in the Indo-Pacific care deeply about what's going on in Ukraine. And the reason, again, is because they know that if any country is allowed to act with impunity and to commit acts of aggression, that's a signal to would-be aggressors everywhere that it's open season. And that's going to be bad for everyone. So, again, I listened to him. Can't speak to whether he listened to me, but I didn't hear anything new.
Just for
So the question of committing aggression with impunity might be thought by some people to apply to the United States, with a series of forever wars that we have started or continued well past the point where they should have been ended. And I think it's really disappointing that Mr. Blinken, after almost 4 years in office, still doesn't appear to understand the importance of diplomatic dialogue and sees military deployments as a satisfactory substitute for it.
And it just continues down the path of the. I actually saw something in the Washington Post a couple of days ago. Not just the militarization of foreign policy, but almost a militarization of the State Department itself. In that you have them not talking to anybody that we don't like at all, and using more and more military means, actually, even and advocating for that. So how do you see that deterioration?
Well, our foreign policies now are almost exclusively coercive. We offer nothing. We threaten much. And in fact, sanctions are economic warfare. That's our preferred method of dealing with the world. There doesn't seem to be any debate about this in the presidential campaigns. Mr. Trump offers an enhanced version of that with massive tariffs and protectionist measures directed against everybody, including our allies and friends, as well as our declared adversaries. Kamala Harris seems to be squirming to break ranks a bit with Mr. Biden. If you look at the Fox News interview with her, that's pretty clearly her intent. But not many people find that credible. There's no indication that the neoconservatives who favor this disastrous policy and approach to foreign policy would be displaced in a Harris administration. So the world looks at the United States, and you see this in polling data. When asked to rank the greatest threat to them, we come out on top, not Russia. And it may be true that people in the Indo-Pacific, which is a fictional concept that coincides with the command in Hawaii's area of responsibility, it doesn't exist geopolitically. India is not connected to Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia in the way that we would like. You look at a country like India in South Asia, which is the major part of the Indo-Pacific concept. And what are they doing? They are establishing even closer relations with Moscow. Their trade, their dependence on Russian oil is notorious. Their weaponry continues to come mainly from Russia, although they now get some from us and other Western sources as they try to diversify their dependence. But it's hard to square the world that we can all quite clearly see with the world that Mr. Blinken imagines. That is not, the world has not rallied behind the collective West in against Russia. It has said, that's your war, not ours, and we don't want any part of it, except we'd like it to end.
Yeah. And how do you see along those lines and people moving away from the United States, to what extent do you see the BRICS summit coming up next week as a risk or possibly even threat economically to the Western financial system that's been in place since the end of World War II?
Well, I think it's much more than a threat to the Western financial system, although it is that. It's very clear that workarounds for SWIFT, the organization that we control in Belgium, that is the clearinghouse for global trade transaction settlement, workarounds to that are very much on the agenda. A lot of innovative thought has gone into creating digital currencies and avoiding the use of the dollar and the Federal Reserve in New York, which is how we impose sanctions on everyone. People around the world are all tired of that. But it's a much bigger event than that, because the BRICS, which started as a sort of a protest movement against dollar and other American forms of dominance, has now emerged as a rule-making body. And earlier we heard the Israeli ambassador to the UN decry the UN and so on. And he's not alone in this, but others decry it because of its lack of effectiveness, not because it sees the war crimes that Israel is committing and condemns them. So I think what we're seeing is the birth of an alternative rulemaking body, which is already very significant in terms of the number of people and the amount of industrial power and economic power that it that it embraces. It will expand after the Kazan meeting, pretty clearly. There will be more members of it. It is attracting more and more support. And I think countries joining it see it as the place from which they can begin to devise an alternative to the US-dominated world order that the UN represents. It's ironic. We don't take the UN seriously in the United States. We're very down on it. We use it to cast vetoes, and we forget that the right to cast vetoes and block other countries is because there is a UN. If there weren't a UN, if it went the way of the League of Nations, we would not have that power because people are sick and tired of it around the world.
Yeah.
It is an obstacle to progress rather than a support for it, as it once was. You never hear an American president refer to international law, the UN Charter, or anything else, even though we were the authors of much of that. And so it is the Kazan meeting has to be considered both as in the financial terms that you mentioned, and in, that is, geoeconomic context, and in the geopolitical and geomilitary context. It's not a military alliance, but it can facilitate cooperation between different militaries as an alternative to our overwhelming military dominance of the world at present.
And then when you look at the military aspect of the developments, really going back to the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and then our collective response to it, and then you add on the Israeli situation a year ago, and you see that our actions are shoving China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran militarily into an ever stronger relationship, now much more open than it ever was before, and becoming a quasi-military alliance, at least among some of those with Russia. This just seems to be going in the wrong direction. And do you see anything stopping that motion?
No, they're coming together to defend themselves against us, because we have threatened every one of them. We are actively engaged in trying to weaken and isolate Russia in Ukraine, and we have participated in attacks on Russian territory very provocatively. I think the Russians have privately warned us in a sufficiently intimidating manner to deter a further expansion of this, which is another thing that Mr. Zelensky put as point number 2 in his 5-point plan, attacking Russia. I don't think there's much stomach for that anymore. The main point is they're coming together for self-defense, not to mount an attack on the United States, not to take territory. I mean, the only territory at issue really is Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, which the Russians had earlier agreed should remain part of Ukraine, provided they had autonomy. And it was the government in Kyiv and the West that repudiated the Minsk Accords that accomplished that. And then we also have the notion of Taiwan as part of China, which is something that we acknowledged, and something we actually invented the One China policy when we decided that Chiang Kai-shek in Taipei was the governor, was the legitimate government of all of China, including at that time the independent state of Mongolia, which he claimed for China. And we endorsed that claim. So we're just not in a good position to argue that the forces we are pushing together, Moscow, Beijing, Pyongyang, Tehran, are doing this because they want to go after us. They're afraid of us, and we've gone out of our way to make them afraid of us. So that's what you get when you threaten people. You shouldn't be surprised if they try to make common cause to defend themselves.
And you mentioned earlier in this broadcast about your concerns about starting a World War III, and you didn't pick any specific area saying it might be, but you actually hit all 3 areas there. what most concerns you about how such a conflict could actually start?
Well, it doesn't seem to be out of the realm of possibility because of the complete ineptitude of American statecraft at present. You mean, tell me there's, you heard Mr. Blinken, he said he didn't hear anything from Lavrov that was new. I don't think he said anything new. There's no change in prospect on that front. Is there a change in prospect on the Taiwan issue? It seems to be getting more tense and more ready for combat than it was. We are complicit in Israeli threats against Iran. We always have been. But now we have our own forces in Israel assisting Israel, backing Israel, providing cover for Israel as it launches some sort of attack on Iran. Maybe the Israelis, in fact, will have agreed and will not attack Iranian nuclear facilities or refineries, although, as I said, Israeli assurances don't have much weight, given experience. But if they do go after Iran, they will do so both because we have protected them and because they are confident they can drag us into that war. If we get into a war with Iran, I think the other players on the planet that we have relied on military deterrence to immobilize will consider what sort of opportunity that represents. So it could start anywhere. I mean, we've managed to brew up 3 or 4 possibilities for war, any one of which could be devastating, and most of which, with the exception of the Iranians, involve nuclear powers. North Korea, Russia, China, all have arsenals that can strike the United States. And so going back to the bombing of Yemen from a base in the United States by the B-2 bomber, if that is the origin of our power projection, do we think it will be exempt from retaliation indefinitely?
Yeah. No, not a safe bet.
So I think there needs to be a good deal more thought and realism and recognition that we once could control everything in the world. There was a unipolar movement, but it didn't last very long. And the world is now what I call multinodal. That is, there are many connection points. It's three-dimensional. It's not linear and multipolar and two-dimensional. And it's dynamic. It changes. The nodes rotate. They change. The directions of connections change in response to events. In our own hemisphere, we have a major problem with Venezuela, which we have spent a decade trying to engineer regime change in, and immiserating Venezuelans to the point where we have a whole bunch of Venezuelan refugees in the United States, and other parts of Latin America have been overwhelmed by them. That is a problem. We haven't solved the problem of Cuba, which is 90 miles off our shores. We've used coercive measures now for how long? I think it's something like
8 years, isn't it?
80 years,
Yeah.
and it hasn't worked. It didn't work with North Korea. Why do we think that we can engineer regime change without getting blowback? Or we can do it with sanctions, or we can somehow, as we did in Iraq, invade and everything will be wonderful, and we'll overthrow the regime and a bunch of really good guys will come in its place. Did that happen in South Vietnam when we did regime change there with Ngo Dinh Diem assassinated by us? No. Is there any evidence for the neocon theory that use of force can solve all problems? I don't think there is. So the question is, when are we going to wake up and take a serious look at the record and reform ourselves?
Well, let's hope that it comes before the unknown spark happens somewhere in all these different theaters you're talking about there, that any one of which could light a conflagration that won't be quenched until it burns out its fuel. we have to hope that we can get it figured out before that time, because it is still possible until that spark lights a big fire. It still remains possible. We just have to hope that somehow a leader can rise from somewhere to where we recognize all the things you just mentioned while there's still time to navigate them away from the abyss. We'll just have to hope.
Hope is not a strategy.
It's not, but it's all I got right now, Mr. Ambassador. So yeah, let me have that little thing to cling on to, because otherwise it's not a very pretty picture. But hey, listen, what we do here on this channel is we tell the truth, and we're unintimidated and uncompromised, no matter what it is, even if it's something like this. And we're going to continue to do it. And we are very grateful for you to give extraordinary clarity on exactly what we're facing right now. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Danny, for what you do.
And we appreciate you guys, like we always do, for joining us here today. Please do like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. That helps out more than you may know. And we will be back later on. But Gary, what do we have up next in the queue? I hadn't even seen the list here.
We got Matt Ho at 1 o'clock.
That's right. That's right. We got Matt Ho back, one of our also faves. And so please do join us at 1 o'clock today on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.